the lost city of the Hittites. You've probably heard of the Romans, the Greeks, maybe even the Assyrians, but the Hittites, for most of history, they were completely forgotten, erased so thoroughly from human memory that they became little more than mysterious names scattered through ancient texts. Yet 3,000 years ago, they ruled one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen, with their capital hidden somewhere in the heart of Anatolia, waiting to be rediscovered. The story begins not with ancient warriors or bronze chariots, but with a 19th century French explorer named Charles Texier wandering through the Turkish countryside in 1834. He wasn't looking for lost cities. He was searching for Roman ruins, following old maps and older rumors. But what he stumbled upon in a remote village called Boğazkale would rewrite everything scholars thought they knew about the ancient world. Picture the scene: rolling hills covered in scrubby grass, shepherds tending their flocks among weathered stones that seemed far too regular, far too intentional to be natural formations. Texier noticed something the locals had long taken for granted: massive stone blocks carved with strange figures and inscriptions in a language nobody could read. These weren't Roman. They were far, far older. The ruins stretched across the landscape, suggesting a city of enormous proportions, yet no historical record he knew mentioned anything about such a place existing here. What Texier had found were the remains of Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, a civilization so completely lost to time that even its name had been forgotten. The city had been abandoned around 1200 BCE. During that mysterious period historians call the Bronze Age collapse, when civilizations across the Mediterranean crumbled almost simultaneously. For over 3,000 years, Hattusa lay silent, its temples and palaces slowly dissolving back into the earth, its people's achievements fading into myth. But here's where the story gets interesting. While Texier had found the physical city, nobody yet knew what it was. The Bible mentioned Hittites, describing them as one of the peoples living in Canaan, but most scholars dismissed these references as legendary or insignificant. Some even argued the Hittites never existed at all, that they were just another fictional tribe invented by biblical scribes. The ruins Texier found seemed important, certainly, but important to whom? What empire had built them? The answer lay buried in the thousands of clay tablets scattered throughout the ruins, written in cuneiform script that looked tantalizingly familiar, yet frustratingly unreadable. These tablets sat in museums for decades, while scholars puzzled over them, trying to crack their code. The breakthrough came in 1915, when a Czech linguist named Bedřich Hrozný managed to decipher the language. What he discovered was revolutionary. The Hittite language was Indo-European, related to Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and most modern European languages. This meant that 3,000 years ago, people speaking an ancient ancestor of English, German, and Hindi had ruled a vast empire from the mountains of Anatolia. Suddenly, the biblical references made sense. The Hittites weren't minor tribal people. They were major players on the ancient world stage, powerful enough to challenge Egypt itself. In fact, archaeologists discovered that the Hittites had fought the Egyptians to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, one of the largest chariot battles in history. The subsequent peace treaty between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Rameses II is the oldest surviving international peace agreement, and a copy still hangs in the United Nations building in New York. But what was life actually like in Hattusa? As excavations continued through the 20th century, a picture began to emerge of a sophisticated urban centre unlike anything else in the Bronze Age world. The city was massive, covering about 180 hectares at its height, with a population estimated between 40,000 and 50,000 people. That might not sound huge by modern standards, but for the Bronze Age it was enormous, rivaling the greatest cities of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The city's defences were particularly impressive. Hattusa was surrounded by a double wall stretching for 6 kilometres, built from massive stone blocks that still stand in places today. These weren't simple barriers, they were sophisticated fortifications featuring towers, gates, and a complex system of defensive positions. 3 monumental gates pierced these walls. The Lion Gate, decorated with carved stone lions. The King's Gate, featuring a relief of a Hittite warrior god. And the mysterious Sphinx Gate, originally flanked by massive Sphinx sculptures that are now displayed in museums in Istanbul and Berlin. Walking through these gates 3,000 years ago, you would have entered a city built on multiple terraces, climbing up the rocky hillside. The lower city contained the homes of ordinary citizens, workshops, and storage facilities. But as you climbed higher, the buildings became grander, the streets wider. The upper city held the palaces and temples of the Hittite elite, structures built with a combination of stone foundations and mud brick walls, their interiors likely painted with colourful frescoes. The heart of Hattusa was the great temple, dedicated to the storm god Teshub and the sun goddess Arena. This wasn't just a place of worship, it was an economic powerhouse, controlling vast estates and employing hundreds of workers. Archaeologists found clay tablets here, recording everything from religious rituals to grain inventories, giving us an incredibly detailed picture of how this temple economy functioned. The complex included storage rooms, workshops, and living quarters for priests and temple staff. Some of these storage rooms still contain the massive clay jars called pithoi that once held grain, oil, and wine. But perhaps the most exciting discovery at Hattusa was the royal archives, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets that served as the administrative heart of the empire. These weren't just religious texts or propaganda, they were the real working documents of government. Treaties with foreign powers, legal codes, royal correspondence, military records, and even the private letters of kings and queens. Reading through these tablets is like eavesdropping on conversations from 3,000 years ago, hearing the concerns, fears, and ambitions of people long dead. One particularly fascinating set of tablets records the correspondence between the Hittite queen Puduhepa and the Egyptian queen Nefertari, wives of the kings who made peace after the Battle of Kadesh. These letters show sophisticated women engaging in international diplomacy, discussing everything from the terms of the peace treaty to arrangements for a royal wedding between the two dynasties. Puduhepa writes with authority and intelligence, clearly a major political player in her own right, not just a decorative consort. The tablets also revealed something unexpected about Hittite law and society. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Hittites seem to have had a relatively humane legal system. Their law codes emphasized restitution over punishment, preferring compensation to victims rather than brutal retribution against criminals. For many crimes, even serious ones, the penalty was simply to pay back what was taken or damaged, plus additional compensation. The death penalty existed but was reserved for only the most serious offences, particularly those involving treason or sorcery. Women in Hittite society appear to have had more rights than in many contemporary cultures. They could own property, conduct business, and even divorce their husbands under certain circumstances. Queens like Puduhepa wielded real political power, serving as co-rulers alongside their husbands and continuing to influence policy even after their husbands' deaths. The tablets mention female scribes, priestesses, and business owners, suggesting that educated, economically independent women weren't unusual in Hittite cities. The Hittites were also remarkably tolerant when it came to religion. Rather than imposing their gods on conquered peoples, they simply added foreign deities to their own pantheon. The result was an incredibly diverse religious landscape, with Hurrian, Babylonian, and local Anatolian gods all worshipped alongside traditional Hittite deities. The Hittites believed that all gods were real and powerful, so it made sense to honor as many as possible. This theological flexibility probably helped them maintain control over their diverse empire, allowing subject peoples to keep their traditional beliefs while still acknowledging Hittite political authority. The religious center of the Hittite world wasn't actually in Hattusa itself, but about a kilometer away at a place called Yazilakaya, an open-air rock sanctuary that remains one of the most mysterious and evocative Hittite sites. Here, carved into the living rock, is an extraordinary procession of gods and goddesses, more than 60 deities marching in two converging lines. The main gallery shows male gods approaching from one side and female deities from the other, meeting in the center where the storm god Teshub faces the sun goddess Arena, the chief deities of the Hittite pantheon. The precision of these carvings, the artistry of the relief work, and the sheer ambition of decorating an entire rock outcrop with divine imagery speaks to the importance of this sanctuary. Scholars believe it was used for important seasonal festivals, particularly the spring celebration of the new year, when the Hittite king would renew his relationship with the gods and reaffirm his right to rule. But despite their power, their sophisticated culture, and their impressive achievements, the Hittites vanished. Around 1200 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned, burned, and left to the elements. The exact sequence of events remains mysterious, but it seems to have been part of that broader Bronze Age collapse that destroyed or severely damaged virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece burned. The great cities of the Levant were destroyed. The Egyptian New Kingdom barely survived, and the Hittite Empire simply ceased to exist. What caused this collapse? Scholars have proposed numerous theories, and the truth probably involves a combination of factors rather than a single cause. Climate change appears to have played a role, with evidence suggesting a severe drought affecting the entire region. The Hittite tablets themselves mention food shortages, with desperate letters from the last kings requesting emergency grain shipments from Egypt. Famine weakens states, makes populations restless, and can trigger migration and conflict. There's also evidence of invasion and warfare. Egyptian records mention mysterious sea peoples, maritime raiders who attacked coastal cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Some scholars think these weren't a unified force, but rather displaced populations, refugees from other collapsed regions, who turned to raiding and migration when their own societies failed. The Hittite tablets mention attacks by groups from the west, possibly these same sea peoples or related populations displaced by turmoil in the Aegean. Internal political instability likely contributed as well. The tablets hint at succession disputes and power struggles among the Hittite elite. When external pressures mounted, the empire may have simply fractured along these existing fault lines, unable to mount a coordinated response to the cascading crises. The last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, left records of military campaigns, but then the written record simply stops. We don't know how he died or what happened to the royal family. What we do know is that someone made the decision to abandon Hattusa. The archaeological evidence suggests this wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a deliberate evacuation. People took their valuables, packed up what they could carry, and left. Then the city burned, whether accidentally or intentionally, we can't say. The massive stone fortifications remained standing, but the wooden and mud brick structures collapsed and crumbled. Wind-blown soil gradually covered the ruins, grass and shrubs took root, and within a few generations, the greatest city of Anatolia had disappeared beneath the earth. The Hittite people didn't vanish entirely, though. Their empire fragmented into smaller kingdoms that survived for several more centuries in what scholars call the Neo-Hittite period. These kingdoms, centered in what is now southern Turkey and northern Syria, maintained elements of Hittite culture, writing, and religion, even as they mixed with Aramean and other populations. Eventually, they too were conquered and absorbed by the expanding Assyrian Empire in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The last speakers of the Hittite language probably died out sometime in the first millennium BCE, and with them went the living memory of their great empire. For the next 2.5 millennia, the Hittites existed only in fragmentary references, mysterious names in Egyptian inscriptions, and biblical texts that nobody could fully explain. The city of Hattusa lay silent, its stones slowly weathering, its tablets waiting patiently to tell their stories. Local villagers used the ancient stones for building material, unwittingly incorporating pieces of temples and palaces into their humble homes. They had no idea they were living among the ruins of an empire. When Texier first saw those ruins in 1834, he recognized their importance, but couldn't identify their builders. When the tablets were finally deciphered decades later, the revelation was stunning. Here was a major Bronze Age civilization, completely forgotten, being brought back to life through archaeology and scholarship. It was as if an entire chapter of human history had been restored, filling in gaps that scholars didn't even know existed. Modern excavations continue to reveal new aspects of Hittite civilization. Advanced technologies like ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery have identified previously unknown structures buried beneath the soil. Recent discoveries include what appears to be a large administrative complex in the lower city, and possible royal tombs that haven't yet been excavated. Each field season brings new tablets, new artifacts, new insights into how these people lived, worked, prayed, and governed. The lost city of Hattusa teaches us something important about history and memory. Entire civilizations can be forgotten, their achievements erased, their very existence questioned. The Hittites ruled an empire, fought Egypt to a standstill, developed sophisticated laws and governance, created beautiful art and architecture, and then simply vanished from human memory. If not for archaeologists patiently reconstructing their story from ruins and tablets, we might never have known they existed. Standing among the ruins of Hattusa today, you can still feel the weight of that lost empire. The massive stone gates still guard empty streets. The foundations of the great temple still mark out sacred space, and the rock carvings at Yazilikaya still show their procession of forgotten gods. The wind whispers through the ruins, much as it must have 3,000 years ago, when this was a living city full of voices, activity, and ambition. The Hittites believed their empire would last forever, that their gods would protect them, that their power was eternal. They were wrong, of course, but then so was everyone else who thought the Bronze Age would never end. The lost city of the Hittites reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations are temporary, that power and glory fade, and that sometimes the only thing that survives is the story, waiting in the earth to be rediscovered and told again to new generations who will, perhaps, learn something from those who came before. Sleep to history's mysteries. The lost continents. The world quiets around you as night settles in, and as your thoughts drift like distant tides against the darkened shore, we step softly into the half-remembered places of the earth. You breathe slowly, gently, letting the last traces of the day dissolve. The oceans deepen around us. The stars draw faint silver lines across the sky, and beneath that vastness lies a question as old as humanity itself. What vanished beneath the waves? What worlds were lost to time? Tonight we drift back, far back, into the silent waters of history's greatest mysteries. The lost continents, whispered in ancient texts and echoed in geological riddles, pull us into their quiet embrace. They are places that shimmer at the edge of memory, half myth, half possibility, suspended somewhere between science and dreams. They exist in that tranquil space where facts cradle legends, and where legends fall gently into the sea. Let your breathing settle into a soft rhythm. Let the mind loosen like soft sand under tide. We begin now, drifting across the surface of the world's forgotten lands. Far beneath the Atlantic Ocean, the water is still and old, colder than memory, darker than unlit caverns. Here lie the first whispers. Atlantis, Plato's voice, drifts through time like a quiet tide, telling of a grand island empire, rich in shining temples, wide avenues, and circular harbours carved with mathematical perfection. It was said to be larger than Libya and Asia combined, a jewel of the ancient world, until the sea claimed it in a single day and night of ruin. Imagine, for a moment, gliding silently above that deep ocean floor. The water stretches endlessly, a world without wind or wave in this nighttime calm. And somewhere far below, layered in silt and quiet darkness, may rest the faintest ghost of a world that once breathed. Stone pillars fallen like forgotten memories, pathways swallowed in shifting sand, the outlines of a city that may have lived only in story, or may have existed long before recorded time, when coastlines were younger and seas had not yet risen to swallow the world. Atlantis is the most famous of the lost continents, but it is only one dream among many. The earth has forgotten more shores than it remembers. Let your breath slow, like waves washing over worn stone. Far to the south, beyond the cold currents curling around Africa's edge, ancient sailors whispered of Lemuria, a continent stretching across the Indian Ocean, an ancestral homeland of forgotten peoples or vanished creatures. It was proposed in the days before plate tectonics, an attempt to explain mysteries of biology and migration, but its name lingered. Lemuria became a place not of science, but of imagination, lush, tropical, a cradle of early humanity, or lost civilizations whose temples now lie beneath coral and drifting sand. Some pictured it as swaying with emerald forests and rivers wide as seas. Others imagined tall white cities rising above turquoise lagoons. And in every imagining, Lemuria sank long before recorded memory, leaving only fragments in myths from India, Madagascar, Indonesia, and beyond. Now, imagine drifting above that warm sea. The moonlight rests over the water, like a thin sheet of silver. Beneath the surface, shadows shift as if remembering shorelines. Long vanished volcanic ridges curl upward like the silhouettes of broken mountains. The ocean floor drops and rises in quiet patterns, hinting at the possibility that once, long ago, something vast stood here, kissed by sun and wind. You float, weightless, letting your thoughts move slowly, gently. But let us drift farther still to the Pacific, largest, deepest expanse of water on Earth, a world unto itself, a place of silence older than civilization. Here lie legends that predate even the oldest stone carvings, the stories of Mu, long before modern theories. Mystics and Victorian explorers spoke of a continent stretching across the Pacific, home to a sophisticated ancient people who built temples and monuments across what are now small scattered islands. Perhaps Hawaii, Tahiti, Rapa Nui, Easter Island were once mountaintops of a vast land swallowed by the sea. Perhaps the colossal Moai statues are not signs of isolation, but remnants of a culture connected by land that is now gone. As you drift deeper into calm, imagine following the currents toward Rapa Nui. The waves lap gently around giant stone faces staring eternally toward the horizon behind them. Green slopes rise, and beyond them, ocean. Only ocean. Yet the Polynesian stories speak of Hiva, their ancestral home, a great island or continent destroyed in a cataclysm. And as your mind wanders softly through the night, you may picture lush valleys, stone temples, terraces crawling up mountainsides, all now buried beneath an endless Pacific blue. The idea of Mu lingers, not because it is proven, but because it resonates with something deep in the human spirit, a desire to understand where we came from and what worlds existed before us. The ocean holds so many secrets, and silence is often mistaken for absence. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the quiet flow through you like a warm tide. Across the world, ancient maps and legends speak of lands now swallowed or shifted. When Earth's crust moved and changed, when ice sheets melted and seas rose by hundreds of feet, entire landscapes vanished Sundaland. Once a sprawling extension of Southeast Asia, was a vast, fertile region during the last ice age. Rivers wound through plains where now only the South China Sea lies. Human ancestors may have walked along great valleys and settled in coastal cities, now lost to the deep. Slowly, as the glaciers melted, the sea crept forward like a silent tide, filling riverbeds, covering forests, and turning mountains into islands. Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, and the Philippines are fragments of a world once whole, a world now hidden beneath warm tropical waters. Imagine traveling through these Pacific shallows in the soft night. The moon reveals faint shapes beneath the waves, ridges, plateaus, perhaps the outlines of ancient river channels. In the quiet of sleep, it is easy to imagine lights glowing faintly in the deep, lanterns of forgotten villages, or fires long extinguished, but remembered by the earth. Night deepens around us. We drift westward now, toward the Mediterranean, once far lower, carved by rivers flowing through what are now deep basins. When the Atlantic poured in millions of years ago, it transformed the landscape entirely. In this place of shifting seas and rising stones, some believed in the lost land of Tartessos, an ancient Iberian kingdom of silver and bronze, of traders and storytellers, swallowed by floods or earthquakes. Others imagined the long-lost island of Lyonesse off the coast of Britain, a land of saints and monasteries, drowned in a single night. Fishermen still tell of church bells ringing from beneath the waves. Whether myth or memory, such stories cling to coastlines everywhere, reminders that the sea slowly reclaims all things. Let your breathing soften, let the weight of the past settle into a gentle whisper. Toward the far north, beneath ice and shifting tectonic plates, lies the mystery of Hyperborea, an ancient land of eternal spring in the frozen realms beyond the north wind. It appears in Greek text as a paradise untouched by war or sorrow. Some equated it with lands that once lay ice-free during warm epochs. Others saw it as pure myth. But the Earth's climate has shifted many times, and there were ages when the Arctic was green, wrapped in forests and warm breezes. Beneath Greenland's ice sheet lies evidence of ancient vegetation, lakes, and flowing rivers. Worlds erased not by water, but by ice. When your mind rests in the darkness of night, it becomes easier to imagine that once, far above the world, there flourished a land of gentle sunlight and unending calm. And still we drift. South now, to the rim of the Pacific, where the Bering Land Bridge once connected Asia and America. A broad plain, now lost beneath frigid waters, may have supported entire cultures, scattered settlements, and the first human migrations into the New World. The wind that blows over the Bering Sea carries the faintest echo of footsteps across a land long gone. And farther still, beneath the cold waves of the North Sea, lies Doggerland, once the heart of Europe's prehistoric world. It stretched between Britain and Scandinavia, teeming with wildlife, forests, and human settlers. Then, slowly, the sea rose. A tsunami struck, and the land faded, leaving behind only fishing nets that occasionally drag up bones, tools, and fragments of a forgotten life. All across the world, the Earth has erased continents, not always through sudden catastrophe, but often through slow, gentle transformation, like a tide reshaping a shoreline grain by grain. Let your thoughts drift like these grains. Let the quiet carry you. The stories of lost continents are not simply tales of destruction, but reminders of how deeply the world has changed. Shorelines are temporary mountains rise and fall. Forests become seas. Seas become deserts. Civilizations blossom and wither. The earth is ancient, far older than memory, older than legend, older than the words we use to describe time itself. You float now in a world of possibility, imagining coastlines lit by torchlight, temples glowing beneath starlit skies, entire continents alive with cultures that vanished long before anything was written in stone. You drift, calm and weightless, through the stories the ocean keeps. The sea is vast, and so are the memories hidden beneath it. And as we continue this quiet journey toward the deepest, oldest mysteries the planet has ever known, we move ever closer to the edge where myth and history begin to blur, where the ether whispers drift through the deep like soft currents, moving through time as effortlessly as the tide. And as we descend again into that vastness of quiet ocean and forgotten worlds, Your breathing stays slow and gentle, like the steady rhythm of waves washing over an ancient shore. Darkness below grows thicker, but it is not a frightening darkness. It is warm, familiar, like a blanket of time settling over the earth, hiding secrets too old for writing, too large for memory. We drift deeper, letting the ancient waters guide us into places long submerged, long silent. Somewhere in that stillness, there lies an understanding that the continents beneath our feet are not fixed things. They shift, they drift, they crumble, and sometimes they vanish entirely, just as the mind sheds thoughts as it moves toward rest. So too does the earth shed landscapes, trading mountains for plains, shores for seas, land for water. Entire worlds are born, erased, and reborn again across millions of years, each one slipping quietly into the next like a dream, fading into another dream. We drift now towards Zealandia, one of the most extraordinary lost continents of all. Unlike Atlantis, Mu, or Lemuria, Zealandia is not legend but geological truth. Almost the size of Australia, it lies submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean, with only the mountain peaks visible today, as New Zealand, New Caledonia, and a few scattered islands. For millions of years, it rose and fell with tectonic breath. Then, long ago, the sea gently swept across it, leaving only fragments above water. Imagine hovering above its drowned surface. The moonlight paints a soft silver glow across the waves. Beneath them lies a vast plateau, carved by rivers that have not run for tens of millions of years. There are valleys deep enough to hold entire mountain ranges, and mountains tall enough to once have scraped the sky. But all of it now rests under the weight of the ocean, a continent hiding in plain sight. A reminder that even the land we know today can slip quietly into the sea. We breathe softly, drifting. The water grows calm around us. To the west, beneath the Bay of Bengal, lies another mystery, the rumoured lost land of Kumari Kandam. In Tamil tradition, it was said to be a cradle of ancient civilization, a great southern continent connecting India to Antarctica. Modern geology tells another story, yet the legend persists in the hearts of millions. The tale of a land once filled with poets, scholars, and sages. Like many lost worlds, it may carry memories of real ancient floods. Coastal plains drowned by rising seas after the last ice age. Villages swallowed slowly as the shoreline crept inland. Imagine walking along a prehistoric coast where families once lived, where fires once burned, where waves once washed against soil, now hundreds of feet below the modern ocean. As the water rose, inch by inch, year by year, the land receded. Stories remained. Over time, the stories became legend, and legends became the lost continent of Kumari Kandam. The earth is shaped not only by mountains and seas, but also by memory, and memory changes shape as gently as waves smoothing stone. We drift now toward the middle of the Indian Ocean, where the sea floor reveals scars, ridges, plateaus, and sunken fragments of an ancient world. Beneath the Mauritius waters lies evidence of a lost microcontinent called Mauritia, hidden beneath layers of volcanic rock and coral. Long before humans walked the earth, Mauritius split and sank beneath the waves, leaving only Madagascar, India, and tiny island chains as hints of its existence. It had no cities, no temples, no people, but its disappearance shows how easily even whole continents can vanish, leaving only geological whispers behind. Let your shoulders relax, your breath slow and deep. The world grows quieter, softer, more distant, Around us, the planet's history stretches far beyond human memory. There were times when Earth's land masses were assembled into supercontinents: Pangaea, Gondwana, Laurasia, vast sweeping realms where deserts stretched from horizon to horizon and forests ran unbroken across thousands of miles. But before these giants rose, others existed: Rodinia, Columbia, Nuna, each forming, breaking, drifting, and dissolving into oceans that have long since changed shape. Imagine watching continents move as if in slow motion. You stand on ancient stone while mountains rise like long, soft breaths the earth's seas melt away. Rivers carve new paths, valleys deepen, islands drift apart. Everything shifts so slowly that it feels motionless, yet over millions of years, entire worlds rearrange themselves. This is the Earth's quiet truth. Continents are momentary arrangements in an ocean of time. And yet, even against this immense backdrop, human stories cling tightly to vanished lands. We hear echoes of them in Polynesian chants, in Greek philosophy, in Indian epics, in Egyptian priestly tales, and in medieval legends whispered across coastlines. Many cultures speak of lands taken by the sea, sometimes in violent storms, sometimes in gentle rises that unfolded over generations. These stories may not be literal histories, but they capture something true about humanity, that people remember the sea moving, rising, swallowing land. They remember coasts that no longer exist. They remember migrations forced by tides, and over thousands of years, these memories become mythic continents, lost to all but the imagination. Let your mind drift through this tapestry of ancient memory. Let it unravel gently, like mist over a calm morning shore. The Mediterranean hides traces of Bronze Age settlements drowned by earthquakes and shifting coastlines. The Black Sea may have once been a freshwater lake until the ocean broke through, flooding entire valleys. In Japan, sunken ruins off Yonaguni resemble step pyramids, carved by nature, perhaps, or shaped by early humans whose world was slowly overtaken by water. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, divers found stone structures covered in coral, hinting at settlements older than recorded civilization. Everywhere the sea touches land, the sea eventually takes it back. We drift west again toward the Atlantic. Beneath the waters near the Bahamas lie the Bimini Road, rectangular stones arranged in a pattern that some believe are remnants of an ancient civilization. More likely they are natural formations, but even so, their shape invites the imagination to wander. And imagination is part of what keeps lost continents alive. As you breathe softly, the story continues to unfold like a gentle tide. The Azores rise from a deep Atlantic ridge where volcanic mountains push through the sea. Some believe these islands were once peaks of a larger landmass. Ancient maps drawn before the discovery of the Americas showed phantom islands dotting this ocean. Anatolia, Brazil, High Brazil, lands that sailors insisted they saw, even if no one could ever find them again. Perhaps they were tricks of light upon the water, perhaps they were misremembered coastlines, or perhaps, long ago when sea levels were lower, these places truly existed above the waves. As night wraps its calm around your thoughts, you drift through these possibilities without needing answers. The beauty of lost continents lies not in proving them, but in wondering about them. Far to the south, Antarctica itself may guard ancient landscapes buried beneath miles of ice, mountain ranges, valleys, and maybe lakes untouched for millions of years. There were ages when this icy world was covered in forests, where warm breezes carried moisture across a land now locked in frozen silence. Beneath its glaciers may rest fossils of unknown species, traces of climates long forgotten. Antarctica was once part of Gondwana, connected to Australia, Africa, India, South America. When these continents tore apart, Antarctica moved southward, slowly freezing into its modern stillness. Imagine that slow drift, the land becoming colder and quieter, the forests withering, the final rivers freezing into silence, the continent turning to ice, carrying inside it the memory of warm, ancient worlds now completely lost. You sink deeper into calm, and from these geological secrets, we return once more to the human stories, the legends that keep the world's imagination alive. For even if Atlantis never existed as a physical place, it exists as an idea, a reminder of fragility, of knowledge lost, of civilizations that rise and fall like tides. Lemuria symbolizes migration, the mystery of origins, the yearning to understand where humanity began. Mu represents the vastness of the Pacific and the deep time woven into island cultures. Kumari Kandam reflects ancient flood memories and the shifting of coastlines over millennia. All these stories are maps, not of land, but of longing. As you drift, the world grows softer around you. Thoughts slow, breathing settles. The continents of the earth fade into silhouettes beneath a dark ocean sky. Even if no ancient advanced civilizations existed on these lost continents, the planet is full of forgotten worlds, real landscapes that vanished beneath rising seas as the Ice Age ended. Entire regions the size of countries now lie underwater, filled with the remains of forests, plains, and possibly the footprints of people who lived close to the shifting shores. Wherever the ocean is deep, there is the possibility of what once was. Let your mind wander to the depths now, as though floating above the world in a gentle, timeless drift. The ocean is a vast library, its shelves made of stone, its pages written in layers of sediment. It keeps its stories locked beneath pressure and darkness, giving only subtle hints. A fossil lifted from the seabed, a submerged forest, a forgotten coastline revealed by sonar. The Earth holds more history than we can ever uncover, and more mysteries than we can ever solve. You drift now through the last currents of the story, carried by slow, rhythmic waves. The lost continents around you fade into silhouettes, quiet and unreachable, but comforting in their mystery. They remind us that the world is not static. It is alive, constantly shifting, constantly remembering and forgetting. The ocean hums softly, its surface smooth beneath the moonlit sky. Somewhere far below, untouched for ages, lie the remnants of landscapes we will never fully map, mountains worn by time, valleys deepened by ancient rivers, shorelines erased long before the first human drew breath. The earth is ancient, and we are only passing through its memories. And as the story settles into silence, you remain weightless, calm, drifting between the known and the unknown. There is no urgency here, no need for answers, only the soft comfort of possibility, of imagining worlds hidden just beyond reach. The continents that once were and may never be again rest beneath the sea in eternal quiet, but in your mind they drift on, glowing faintly like lanterns carried across dark waters, guiding you toward rest. You exhale slowly. The night deepens, the waves still. The lost continents fade into peaceful darkness, and you drift gently, softly, into sleep. Earth's forgotten continents whisper softly from the depths. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World. The sea was a slow, breathing thing that night, rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping giant. Above it, the sky curved vast and dark, its stars pricked into existence like tiny fires along the roof of the world. A longship rode those gentle swells, its dragon-headed prow cutting a quiet path through the moonlit water. The oars were drawn in, the sail slack, and the men aboard lay in cloaks and furs, drifting in a shallow, watchful sleep. Only one figure remained fully awake. Life stood near the prow, one hand resting on the carved dragon's neck, his other hand wrapped around the leather strap of his cloak as the wind nudged at him. The air smelled of salt and old ice, like the breath of the northern seas he had known since childhood. Somewhere behind them, far beyond the curve of the ocean, lay Greenland, with its sharp cliffs and scattered settlements pressed up against the edge of the world they believed they knew. Ahead, there was only darkness and the whisper of something more. He listened to the water stroking the hull, the faint creak of wood, the soft exhale of sleeping men. It felt to him as though the ship moved not just across the ocean, but across time and memory, gliding toward a story that had been waiting centuries to be told his father's tales. The rumors told in Icelandic halls, the whispered accounts of a strange shoreline found by accident. All of them drifted through his mind like low clouds. They said there was land out here, land beyond Greenland, beyond the shifting floes and cold fogs. Land with forests so thick you could walk among trees for days. Land with rivers that ran clear and deep. Land where grapes grew wild. Where game was plentiful. Where the air itself seemed gentler. Some had laughed at the idea. Others had shrugged and let it pass like any other tale told next to a fire. But the story had grown roots in Leif's mind and taken hold. Now, as the ship glided under the stars, he felt that story pulling him forward. A soft footstep sounded behind him. "You do not sleep," came a low voice. Leif turned slightly. It was Tyrkir, the older man who had travelled with his family for so long. He was as much kin as any blood relative. His hair was threaded with grey, his beard thick, his eyes bright even in the dim light. "Someone should watch the sea," Leif murmured. "The sea will still be here in the morning," Tyrkir replied gently. "It always is." Leif's gaze slipped back to the horizon, though there was nothing to see but darkness and the faint line where sea met sky. "Do you remember," he asked quietly, "what my father said about the land to the west?" Tyrkir stepped up beside him, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. "I remember many things your father said. Some of them were wise, some were spoken after too much mead." A faint smile touched his lips. "But yes, I remember. A coast glimpsed in bad weather. A ship blown off course strange woods. No settlements, only the promise of what might be." Leif nodded slowly. "It feels close, as if we have been drifting toward it our whole lives without knowing." "Stories have a way of doing that," Tyrkir said. "They lie in wait until someone is willing to sail far enough to meet them." The wind shifted, stroking the sail. Somewhere in the darkness, a wave rose a little higher than the others, and then slumped beneath the hull with a soft, hollow sound. The motion swayed the men sleeping along the benches, but they did not wake. The night seemed to fold around the ship like a cloak, isolating it in a small moving circle of creaks and whispers. "Sleep, Leaf," Tirkir said at last. "Morning will come whether you watch for it or not, and you will need clear eyes when it does." Leaf hesitated, then nodded. He gave the dragon's head a final, absent pat, as if to reassure the ship itself, and made his way back toward the center of the longship. He lay down among his men, the boards cooled beneath him, his cloak scratching lightly against his cheek. The motion of the sea cradled him, slow and patient. His thoughts drifted backward, to Greenland, to Iceland, to the tales of the old country across the ocean, but always, like a needle returning to north, his mind turned toward that unnamed shore ahead. He imagined it dimly, a line of land appearing out of morning mist, and as the rocking lulled him at last toward sleep, he felt as though that distant coastline was already watching them approach. Morning stole into the sky gradually, the stars fading one by one, as if some unseen hand were gently snuffing them out. A pale band of light appeared in the east, spreading across the water until the sea shivered with brightness. The men stirred, rolling in their cloaks, blinking at the day. Oars were quietly shifted. A few muttered prayers. Someone coughed, the sound swallowed quickly by the open air. Leif rose, his muscles stiff, but his thoughts sharp. The wind had strengthened, and the sail now caught it, full and rounded, drawing the ship forward with renewed purpose. Foam hissed along the sides. Above, a few seabirds circled, white and grey against the lightning sky. He watched them, feeling his heart quicken. "We are still far from known waters," one of the men murmured, stepping to stand beside him. It was Bjarni, broad-shouldered, with sunburned cheeks and a steady gaze. "Yet there are birds." "Birds mean land," Leif replied quietly. "Somewhere ahead, somewhere near. They do not drift so far from shore for nothing." They sailed on. The hours of the day seemed to stretch and thin, like threads pulled slowly from a loom. The men rowed in turns when the wind slackened, their oars dipping in and out of the water with a slow, unhurried rhythm of practiced work. When the breeze returned, they rested, letting the ship glide. They ate simply, dried fish, bread hard as wood, water carefully portioned, and spoke little. The ocean had a way of taking speech and folding it back into itself until silence felt more natural. But in each quiet glance toward the horizon, there was an unspoken question. As afternoon leaned toward evening, the world shifted. A darker line appeared along the edge of the water, so faint at first it was easy to mistake it for a trick of light, or a cloud bank hanging low. Yet as the longship moved steadily forward, that line did not dissolve. Instead, it grew more distinct, separating itself from sea and sky. The closer they came, the more it took on shape, a low, rolling shadow that stretched across the distance. Leif's breath caught. Without meaning to, he placed a hand again on the dragon's head, as he had in the night, as if seeking balance. "Land," someone whispered. The words spread softly along the length of the ship. Men rose from their benches, squinting against the light, craning their necks. Tirkir moved forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the distant shoreline. "This is no ice," he said after a moment. "No floating bergs, no broken fields of white. This is earth." The ship pressed on. The air began to change as the day dipped lower, carrying scents that were not of the open sea. There was a hint of moss, of soil warmed beneath unseen trees, of something green and quiet. The men fell even more silent, each feeling in his own way the strange intimacy of approaching a land no one among them had ever known. Closer still, and they could see that the coastline was not sheer and forbidding, but gathered into soft rises and dips. Low hills met the water, with darker bands of what could only be forest beyond. The sky above that distant land seemed somehow gentler, its colors washed with a faint, hazy gold. Leif felt a slow, deep calm settle over him. Fear, excitement, wonder, all of it blended into something steady. This was what he had come for, what the ship itself seemed made for, to slip across the unknown and press its prow against a shore that had, until now, existed only in half-remembered stories and scattered rumors. "Bring us in slowly," he said. "We'll look for a bay, a quiet place to land." The men bent to their work with a muted, reverent readiness. The longship angled nearer the shoreline, its sails shifting, oars dipping lightly to guide it. The water shallowed gradually, turning from deep indigo to softer hues, greenish and lit from beneath where the sun's light reached toward the unseen bottom. In the distance, a small cove opened in the coastline, a sheltered curve where the land embraced the sea in a gentle arc. The approach was clear of rocks. The water, calm grasses trailed along the edge, and beyond them, a scatter of low shrubs and the first hints of taller trees, their leaves stirring faintly in the breeze. "That will do," Leif murmured. They glided into the cove as evening colors thickened in the sky. The oars pulled back. The men prepared the anchor stone, letting it slide down with a soft, muffled splash. The longship settled into stillness, the faint rocking of the water, now a reassuring cradle rather than a ceaseless journey. For a long moment, no one moved. They listened to the soft lap of waves against the hull, to the distant rustle of leaves on unknown trees, to the calls of birds they did not recognize. The land, so close now, seemed to breathe quietly, an immense presence that had been waiting patiently for their arrival. Leif drew in a slow breath of air that tasted of soil and growth, different from the sharp salt tang he had known for weeks. "We will go ashore," he said gently. "Not in a rush. Step by step. The sea has carried us far. Let us meet this place with respect." They lowered a small boat and drifted toward the narrow strip of shore. The water around them was glassy, reflecting the subtle colors of the sky. As the keel brushed the sand, a quiet shiver passed through the men, as if they were crossing a boundary, not just of distance, but of time itself. Leif stepped out first. His boots sank slightly into the damp, cool sand. The sensation was strangely profound, as if the earth itself were acknowledging him. He walked a little farther up the beach, until the sand gave way to firmer ground, then stopped and simply stood there. Behind him, the others followed, their footfalls soft. They spread out slowly, touching the low shrubs, bending to feel the texture of unfamiliar plants, lifting their faces to smell the air. No settlement greeted them, no smoke, no voices. Only the quiet murmur of the waves and the occasional call of a bird from the forest's edge. "This is it," Bjarni said quietly, his voice almost breath. "We have stepped onto a land that no one in our world truly knows." Leif nodded. "We will learn its shape," he replied. "We will walk its forests, drink from its streams, and see what stories it holds. And we will carry those stories back, so others may know that the world is wider than they imagined. They moved inland a short distance, careful, unhurried. The ground rose gently, dotted with stones and small patches of grass. The trees beyond were tall and unfamiliar, their leaves shimmering softly in the breeze. Shadows deepened among their trunks as the light faded, but it was not an unfriendly darkness. It felt alive, watchful, without being hostile. As they explored the edge of the woods, Tirkir knelt beside a low vine that trailed across a small rise. Dark clusters of berries hung from it, heavy and ripe. He studied them intently, his face lit with an old, deep memory of other lands, other harvests. "Leif," he called softly. "Come see." Leif joined him, crouching beside the vine. Tirkir plucked a berry, rolling it between his fingers. "I have seen the like before," he murmured, "back in the southern lands, beyond our northern seas. Grapes, or something very like them. Grapes!" The word hung in the air like a promise. "This is a good place," Leif said at last. "A gentle place. Perhaps it will be our Vinland, a land of wine and growth." They did not shout or cheer. The moment was too large for that. Instead, they shared a quiet, steady look, the kind that passes between people who realize they're standing at the opening of a door that will never close again. They returned to the ship at dusk, the sky now brushed with long strokes of purple and deep blue. Stars kindled once more, scattered across the firmament. The men settled in, their voices soft, their movements slowed by a deep, peaceful fatigue that came not just from travel, but from the weight of what they had found. Leif lay awake for a time, listening to the mingled sounds of land and sea. The waves lapped gently against the hull. Somewhere in the nearby forest, a night creature called, an unfamiliar voice in the darkness, neither threatening nor inviting, simply present. He felt the world expanding around him, like the sea had once expanded in his imagination when he first heard tales of distant shores. Now, those shores were under his feet. The map in his mind was no longer bounded by the edges of old stories. It pushed outward, making room for this new coastline, these new trees, these new stars overhead. As sleep finally drew him under, it seemed to him that the dragon-headed ship, resting quietly in the cove, was no longer perched at the edge of the world. Instead, it lay anchored in the middle of a much larger, deeper mystery, one that would carry ripples far into the future, long after their names were forgotten. The night passed, and with the dawn, the work of understanding the land began. They spent the next days exploring the coast, moving carefully along the shoreline, landing where small rivers met the sea, where sheltered inlets offered calm waters, where the forest opened into gentle meadows. They moved like guests who did not yet know the language of their host, watching, listening, learning the quiet patterns of wind and grass and water. They found streams cold and clear, their beds lined with smooth stones. They found stands of tall trees, some dark and needled, others broad-leafed and shifting with every breath of wind. They saw birds whose calls were strange to their ears, and animals slipping through the underbrush, quick shadows in the greenery. At each landing, they left the place as undisturbed as they could, taking only what they needed, marking little. They built small fires, careful with the embers, letting the smoke drift upward in faint grey tendrils. As they sat around those fires at night, The faces of the men flickered in the glow, their eyes reflecting both the light of the flames and the unspoken wonder of being so far from home in a land that had never known their kind. Sometimes, as the embers settled and the conversation faded, someone would speak up softly, telling of other voyages, of Iceland's cold shores, of Greenland's hard edges, of storms weathered and ice fields skirted. Those stories, once the farthest reach of their imagination, now felt like steps along a path that had led here. Leif listened to them all with quiet attention. The more they walked this new coastline, the more he felt that they were not just adding to their own saga, but stitching this land into the larger fabric of the world they knew it had waited, silent and patient, while their people had sailed and settled the north. Now, at last, the threads had crossed. On one of those evenings, as the fire burned low and the stars shimmered overhead in a calm, untroubled sky, Leif lifted his gaze and let it wander across the constellations he had followed since childhood, the familiar shapes that guided sailors across the vastness. "They have always been there," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The stars, the lands, the currents. We have only just learned to see the paths between them." Tyrkir, seated nearby, nodded slowly. "And others may walk those paths after us," he replied. "In time, this land will not be a whisper, but a place with a name spoken in many halls." Leif thought of that, of ships like theirs, of families, of settlements, of fires lit along this distant shore, voices rising in languages that had never touched this air before. The idea felt both distant and very close, like a shadow cast by a fire yet to be lit. For now, though, the land remained mostly untouched, their presence a small ripple in a vast, quiet sea of time. They would not stay long. Their purpose was to see, to know, to remember, and then to return. Yet even as they made their preparations, gathering small sample of wood and grapes and other signs of the richness they had found, a soft certainty settled in Leif's heart. This was not the end of the story. This was only the first line, spoken into the hush of a sleeping world. He felt it in the way the wind curled around the sail, in the way the waves welcomed the keel, in the way the forest watched them with a patience that suggested it expected more visitors in ages to come. When at last they turned the prow of the ship away from the shore and let the wind catch the sail for the journey back toward Greenland, Leif did not feel that they were leaving the land behind. Instead, it felt as though the memory of it had already travelled ahead of them, carried in the shape of the waves, in the flight of birds, in the changing light on the water. The longship moved smoothly across the sea, and the coastline slowly diminished, a dark line, then a smudge, then only an idea. But in the minds of those aboard, it remained vivid. The taste of the air, the softness of the sand beneath their boots, the rustle of leaves and trees that had never known the sound of their speech before. As night fell and the stars reappeared, steady and unchanging, Leif lay awake once more beneath the sky. The same constellations that had accompanied them west now stretched overhead, guiding them eastward toward home. Yet home itself had shifted, its boundaries stretched by what they had seen. He closed his eyes and saw again the curve of that sheltered cove, the ripples along its surface, the way the forest wended just beyond the line of shore. The voyages, he realized, were not just paths cut through the sea. They were threads binding places together, making the world feel at once larger and more connected. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, he felt himself drifting gently towards sleep as the ship rocked and the waves whispered their long, slow lullaby. Years later, long after the first journey, when the memory of that gentle coastline settled into the hearts of many, other ships would follow. The ocean did not change its nature for them. It remained the same vast, restless being, breathing wind and wave, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce. Yet the men who set out upon it were different. They carried with them the knowledge that the sea did not simply fall away into nothingness beyond Greenland. They knew there was land in that wide westward silence, land with forests and flowing waters, land where grapes and game and timber might be found. And so the voyages continued. One ship, smaller than Leif's, but sturdy and well made, set out from Greenland under a sky streaked with pale clouds. Among its crew were men and women who had heard the stories of Vinland as children, their imaginations shaped by the tales of their elders. Now, they wanted to see for themselves what lay beyond the horizon. The leader of this voyage, Karlsefni, stood at the helm with a quiet determination. He had listened to life's accounts by the longhouse fire, had seen the wood and grapes and other tokens brought back from that distant shore. To him, Finland was not just a curiosity, it was a possibility, a place where families might settle, where farms might take root, where winter might be kinder than in the cold, hard lands of the north. As the ship rocked gently on the swells, his gaze travelled over the faces of those aboard. There were strong-armed sailors, used to hauling nets and rowing through sleet. There were women cradling children, their eyes bright with both worry and hope. There were older men, grey in hair, but still sharp of mind, who had seen many coasts and now wished to see one more. Crossing was not simple. There were days when fog wrapped itself around the ship so tightly that the world shrank to the sound of water against the hull and the feel of damp air on their skin. There were nights when the wind rose and the waves lifted them high, then dropped them deep into cold hollows, the ship's timbers groaning softly with the strain. Yet they held to their course, guided by the stars and currents, and by the quiet belief that beyond the arc of the sea, that remembered shore still waited. When, at last, the birds appeared and the scent of unseen earth drifted over the water, a murmur passed along the ship. People straightened, eyes turned eagerly toward the horizon. As before, the first sight of land came like a slow revelation, a dark line, a soft shape, a coastline emerging from haze. Karlsefni stood silent as they approached, his heart beating in slow, heavy thuds. For him, this was more than the fulfillment of a story. It was the opening of a new chapter in the lives of those who had left behind their homes for the unknown. They found, not far from where Leif's ship had once anchored, a place that seemed well suited to their hopes. A gentle river flowed into the sea, its mouth widening into a sheltered bay. Meadows spread along its banks, and beyond them, forested hills rose in quiet layers. They landed cautiously, as Leif's crew had done years before, stepping onto the sand with a mixture of reverence and careful curiosity. But this time, there was more activity, more movement. They unloaded goods, tools, livestock. They walked the ground not just as visitors, but as people looking for the best places to build shelters, to plant crops, to tether animals. The land received them with the same quiet patience it had shown the first explorers. The river ran on, untroubled, its surface reflecting the sky. Birds flitted through the trees, indifferent to the newcomers. Wind moved in the grass with a sound like the soft breathing of a sleeping world. They built their first dwellings near the river's edge, simple structures of timber and turf, low but sturdy, their roofs blending into the land itself. Smoke soon began to curl upward from their hearts, thin grey lines against the sky. Children's voices, unsure at first, then more confident, mixed with the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves. At night, the people of this small settlement gathered around their fires, the glow casting gentle halos around their faces. They spoke of home, of Greenland's harsh winters, of Iceland's volcanic shores, of the old stories from Norway and beyond. Yet more and more, their words turned to this place, the feel of the soil beneath their hands, the taste of its water, the paths through its forests. They gave names to the river, to the bay, to the nearby hills, stitching their own language into the fabric of the land. Those names, carried on the wind and spoken over meals, warmed the place with a quiet familiarity. Yet they knew they were not alone in this wide world. In time, they saw signs that others lived here too. Not their kind, but people whose presence was written in the remains of fires, in tracks along the riverbank, in tools left near berry bushes. The first encounters were distant, a glimpse of figures in the trees, a canoe moving quietly along the far shore of the river, the echo of voices carried by the wind. Karlsefni, standing at the edge of the forest one morning, saw 3 figures watching from across a meadow. They were still as stones, yet he could feel their alertness even at a distance. He lifted his hand, palm open, a gesture as old as greeting itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the figures lifted a hand as well, mirroring his motion. The moment passed like a breath. The figures melted back into the trees, gone as silently as they had appeared. Life in the settlement unfolded in rhythms shaped by the land. They fished in the river, the lines dipping into water that ran quiet and deep. They hunted game in the forest, moving with care, learning where the deer passed, where the wild animals drank at dusk. They gathered berries and other plants, guided sometimes by what they already knew, sometimes by cautious experimentation. Season followed season. The days grew longer, then shorter, then longer again. The settlers began to sense how the year turned in this new place, how the light shifted and the winds changed. Winter came, but it was softer than the winters of Greenland. Snow fell, but it did not seem as heavy. The river froze along its edges, but not entirely. The forest, even in its bareness, felt alive. Yet with all the gentleness of the land, there were difficulties. Crops did not always grow as expected. The unfamiliar plants sometimes concealed dangers hunting could be uncertain. And beneath everything lay an undercurrent of unease, a sense that the invisible lines between their world and that of the Maple who already lived here were delicate. Sometimes at night, Karlsefni lay awake, listening to the sounds beyond the walls of his hall, the crackle of the fire, the shifting of sleepers, the distant hoot of an owl. He thought of how far they were from the familiar coasts of home, how thin the line of their presence was here. It felt like a small flame burning in a vast darkness, beautiful, hopeful, but fragile. He did not speak of this often. Instead, he rose each morning and joined in the work, repairing structures, planning hunting trips, walking the paths near the settlement's edge, watching the tree line where the forest began. Over time, the encounters with the native people of the land grew more frequent. There were moments of quiet exchange, a shared fish, a traded tool, a hesitant smile. There were moments of tension, when a movement was misunderstood or a boundary crossed unknowingly. The people of the settlement began to understand that they were not simply writing their own story here. They had entered into a story already in progress, one with its own deep roots and countless voices. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the river's surface turned to silver, Karlsefni stood with a small group near the edge of the settlement. A canoe approached along the river, paddled by two figures. They came slowly, without haste, their motions smooth and calm. When they drew near the shore, they paused, measuring the distance, measuring the faces watching them. Karlsefni stepped forward, leaving his weapons behind. He held out a small object, a piece of cloth dyed with a bright, rich color. The canoe's nearer paddler studied it for a moment, then reached into a woven bag and brought out a carved object, a small figure of wood shaped with care. They traded, hands crossing briefly over the water between canoe and shore. No words were shared that either side could understand. Yet in that exchange, something quiet passed between them, a recognition that, for all the distance and difference, they shared the same sky, the same river, the same night that would soon settle over the land. The voyages of the Vikings to this new world were not only journeys of distance, they were journeys of understanding, incomplete and fragile as all first meetings are. Those who came built their homes, but also carried with them the weight of their own history, their own ways of seeing the world. The land, already rich with the stories of those who had lived here for generations beyond counting, received them, but did not yield its entirety. In time, many of the settlers would leave. Some would find the uncertainties too great, tensions too wearing. Others would simply long for the familiar contours of their old homes. The sea, which had carried them here, would carry them back again. Their houses would stand for a while, then slowly dissolve into the earth, wood rotting, turf blending back into soil. Grass would grow where walls once stood. Trees would reclaim open spaces. The river would continue its slow journey to the sea, indifferent to the brief presence of those who had paused along its banks. Yet the memory of these voyages would persist. In Greenland, in Iceland, in the far halls of Norway, tales would be told of Finland, the gentle land to the west where grapes grew and winters were kind. For some, the tales would be almost dreamlike, blurred at the edges, more myth than record. For others, they would be as real as the feel of salt spray on one's face. Parents would tell their children about the time their kin had crossed a vast unknown and touched a shore no one had known before. Around fires, in the dark of winter, voices would speak of forests that seemed endless, of rivers that carried sunlight along their surfaces, of birds whose cries were unlike any heard in the north. They would speak of canoes on quiet waters, of wary greetings, of the realization that the world was filled with many peoples, each with their own ways, their own understanding of the land. Generations would pass, the voyages would slip into the long river of memory, mingling with other tales of far journeys and harsh seas. Some would forget the exact details, names would fade, dates would blur, but the core of the story would remain, that once, long before many would believe or fully understand it, ships from the far north had sailed across the western sea and touched another continent. Far to the west, where the river flowed into the sea and the forest watched the shore, the land remembered in its own way. The old paths through the trees remained, traced by animals and people alike. The places where fires had once burned held a different quality to the soil, a subtle richness. A stone that had once been shaped by hands far from this place might lie half buried in the earth, moss creeping slowly over it, its meaning lost, yet its presence undeniable. Birds flew overhead, following their own inherited routes. Seasons turned. Children born in the villages of the land grew up with their own stories, some of which included mention of strangers in long boats, of brief visits, of small exchanges. For them, these were not tales of discovery, but of encounters, moments when different worlds brushed lightly against each other before moving apart again. The sea, indifferent to questions of who came first or who discovered whom, continued to rise and fall, its waves erasing and redrawing the shoreline in small, ceaseless ways. It remembered each ship that had crossed its surface only as a disturbance in its pattern, a momentary reordering of foam and current. Yet, in some sense, each voyage left an imprint, not in the water itself, but in the minds and hearts of those who sailed, and in the stories they carried home. Centuries later, when other ships from other lands would make similar crossings, guided by different maps and driven by different desires, the ocean would greet them with the same impartial motion, the land would receive them with the same quiet patience. New names would be given, new flags planted, new claims spoken. But beneath all of that, the older truth would remain. The world had always been wide, always filled with countless lives and stories, long before anyone people set sail to measure it with their own eyes. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World were a part of that truth. A series of journeys that, like soft waves, rolled gently from one shore to another, leaving behind traces that would sometimes be forgotten, sometimes rediscovered. Their longships, with their dragon heads and curved hulls, were instruments of curiosity as much as of bravery, carrying not just warriors, but farmers, traders, families, dreams. In the quiet of a long northern night, when the wind howled outside and snow pressed against the walls, it was easy to imagine those longships again, to see them drifting under a sky sprayed with stars, their sails catching the pale light of the moon. To picture men wrapped in cloaks against the chill, staring into the darkness ahead, and wondering what shape the morning would bring to the edge of the sea. A storyteller, seated by the hearth, might pause and let the silence stretch. The listeners, leaning closer, would feel the hush deepen, as if the room itself were waiting. Then, in a soft, steady voice, the storyteller would speak of Leif and his men, stealing through the night toward a coastline they had only half believed in, of the first step onto that damp, cool sand, of the grapes on the vine, heavy and ripe beneath an unfamiliar sky, of Karlsefni's settlement beside the river, of the smoke rising in thin spirals, of the quiet exchanges along the water's edge. The words would flow like the sea, calm and unhurried, carrying the listeners in their minds across the centuries and over the waves, until they could almost feel the rocking of the longship beneath them, hear the creak of the timbers, smell the mingled scents of salt and pine and distant earth. Outside, the wind would go on blowing and the snow would keep falling, but inside, by the fire, the world would gently widen, the edges of the map softening and flowing outward to make space for that distant shore. In that moment, the voyages would not be something lost in the past. They would be happening again, here, in the quiet space between words and breath. The longships would be gliding once more toward a waiting coastline. The stars would be shining above them, as they always had, as they always would. And as the story settled into its final, soft cadence, as the listeners' eyes grew heavy and their thoughts began to drift, the sense would remain that the world is vast and filled with hidden coasts, that beyond each known horizon, there may lie a shore waiting peacefully for the moment someone is brave enough, or curious enough, to seek it. The fire would sink into embers. The room would dim. Sleep would fold itself gently around the listeners, as the memory of waves and distant forests and starlit sails lingered lightly in their minds. Somewhere in that hazy space between waking and dreams, they would feel themselves carried across a wide, calm sea, toward a distant line of land where the river meets the ocean and the trees whisper softly in a language older than any map. And there, upon that quiet shore, the voyages of the Vikings to the New World would go on, not as battles or conquests, but as a slow, enduring echo, a reminder that the world has always been broader, more mysterious, and more beautifully connected than any single story can fully contain.